Stay watching at the end of this video for news of other videos in this series.
When Joseph Haydn, at the age of 77, was at the end of his life, indeed when he was actually on his deathbed, he could hear Napoleon's guns pounding the walls of Vienna. That was in 1809, and the old Europe, the Europe of Haydn and Mozart, with its patronage and its servitude, was disappearing, and fast. And in this program, we look at a man who was a true product of that new age, a composer who brought to the symphony an unprecedented power and dynamism. His name, Ludwig van Beethoven. The most famous opening of the most famous symphony ever composed, Beethoven's Fifth. Fate knocking at the door, say the program notes. Well, that's as may be. But on one occasion, Beethoven claimed he got the idea from the song of a yellowhammer while he was strolling one day in a Viennese park. Well, you can take your pick. As is so often the case, we can read into music whatever we wish. But audiences over the years have obviously preferred the more theatrical image of fate at the door, so that's the one that's remained. I suppose it's inevitable. Look at him, we say, that jutting jaw, the furrowed brow, the idealist, the democrat, a composer whose musical outbursts epitomize the start of a new century, the freedom of the individual, the brotherhood of man, etc., etc., etc. Is he not, after all, everybody's idea of the tormented genius, the composer who really did suffer the cruelest fate imaginable, deafness? And then, in his music, did he not forge his own destiny, and so on? Well, of course, most of that is quite true. But Beethoven's early music grew out of the 18th century just as truly as it heralded the new aspirations of the Europe after the French Revolution. No man is an island, to quote, and even Beethoven used the same raw materials, in other words, rhythm, harmony, melody, and so forth, as Haydn, Mozart, or anybody else. The difference, though, is how he manipulated those raw materials. Let me show you something for a moment. Now, here's a tune that comes later in that Fifth Symphony. Doesn't that bear an uncanny resemblance to the finale of one of Mozart's last three symphonies? Coincidence? No, not at all. If you look in the particular sketchbook where Beethoven roughed out the sketches for the Fifth Symphony, you find that he actually copied out 29 bars of that Mozart finale. Now, here's something else from the Beethoven Fifth. Now, let's compare that with another Mozart symphony, the Jupiter. Well, we could play this game all night with any composer you care to name, but that only reinforces the argument, which is the raw materials are available to anybody. Originality lies in the way that you transform those raw materials and make them your own. And when it's Beethoven you're dealing with, there can be no mistake about that. At the end of the 18th century, Europe was dominated by an undersized upstart from Corsica, Napoleon. He was the symbol of a revolution that burst out of France and threatened to engulf the whole of Europe. And while he kept kings awake at night, Napoleon set idealists dreaming, at least for a while. This democrat incarnate, as Emerson called him, offered not only political freedom, but freedom of thought. Such ideals, combined with the birth of a new century, inspired Beethoven and many other artists to believe in the dawn of a new age where men are valued by their worth and not by their birth. Like Napoleon, the young Beethoven had nothing but his genius to qualify him for greatness, although, from my point of view, Beethoven's genius was a lot bigger than any emperor's or head of state. He would not sit, like Mozart, amongst the flunkies in an archbishop's scullery, for he had the right to assert in his own music his own vision of man. When the French ambassador in 1798 first suggested to Beethoven that he should write a symphony honoring Napoleon, it must have awakened an amazing response. But even Beethoven shrank from the enormity of such a task. Well, perhaps he felt that he had not yet the power to create such a huge portrait. But let us consider him 4 years later on. In the year 1802, Beethoven, once the half-starved son of a drunken bully, had conquered Vienna with his genius for piano playing and composition and improvisation and everything else musical. He was befriended by a prince who gave him honor, money, and the freedom to compose. Before him lay a great international career as a virtuoso. Despite all these wonderful things, his world was crumbling around him. The terrible fear that had haunted him for some years was now a reality. His growing deafness was deemed incurable. At Heiligenstadt, just outside of Vienna, he wrote his will in a fit of depression. October 10, 1802. As the leaves of autumn fall and are withered, so hope has been blighted. O ye men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do ye wrong me. I was always eager to accomplish great deeds, but for 6 years I've been a hopeless case, aggravated by senseless physicians, cheated year after year in the hope of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a permanent affliction. And yet it was impossible for me, of all people, to say, "Speak louder, shout, for I am deaf." How could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which should have been more perfect in me than in others? What humiliation when somebody could stand beside me and hear a flute in the distance, and I heard nothing. Such incidents brought me to the verge of despair. Any more, and I would have put an end to my life. Only art held me back. I could not leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon to produce. Out of that abyss of depression came both his second symphony, which is brilliant and full of confidence, and his third symphony, the Eroica, with its tension and turmoil. And Beethoven was to extend the expressive power of music just as the revolutionary general had claimed to extend the liberty of the individual. But the liberator proved just to be another power-crazed tyrant, and then he crowned himself emperor. And it was at this point where the musician and the politician diverged, and Beethoven, in a rage, defaced the title page of the Eroica and rededicated it, ironically, to the memory of a great man. In his first two symphonies, Beethoven had continued on the traditional lines of earlier composers, Haydn especially. But in the Eroica, his third symphony, Beethoven burst out of the 18th century like the Grand Army out of France. In every aspect of technique, it defied the established order. In the shaping of the themes, in harmony, in the violence of its cross rhythms, in its proportions, and in fact in the very idea of symphonic form. In the old world, Mozart, Haydn, and others depended on the faith that what was there today would still be there tomorrow and possibly even forever. And in their idea of musical form, things ended much as they began. The essence of the classical first movement, for example, was symmetrical. A, B, A. For Beethoven, life was not symmetrical. He could not celebrate a hero by a musical tour that brought you around the same country twice. A symphony by Haydn or Mozart will last, say, 25 minutes or so. The Eroica is twice that length, actually extending the frontiers of symphonic form. Well, how did he think up these structures? How did he set to work? We have a pretty good idea, for he once said, "Once a theme has occurred to me, I can remember it for years. I alter much, rejecting and experimenting until I am satisfied. The development begins in my head, whether in concentrating on the idea, the breadth of treatment, or the pitch, high or low. Since I know what I want, the basic idea never deserts me. It rises and grows. I hear and see the complete picture. There only remains the task of writing it down. Where the ideas come from, I do not know. I do not seek them directly or indirectly. I could grasp them in my hands, walking out of doors in the woods, in the middle of the night, or in the early morning. A poet translates such moods into words. I turn them into sounds." But that was only the start. He then set about transforming these visions into coherent forms, and here he has left a unique record of his methods. He worked in sketchbooks, of which about 50 survive. They are a blow-by-blow or smudge-by-smudge account of his work over almost the whole of his career. They're terribly hard to decipher now. One project overlapped another, musical ideas jotted down now, which may not reach fruition for years to come. Quite apart from his grapplings with the compositions that we know about, it has been estimated that there are sketches for some 80 other pieces. Wouldn't it be marvelous if we could find them? He would work on several things at once. He started on his Fifth Symphony even before his Fourth, which interrupted it in mid-flow. At the same time, he wrote the Sixth, which we call the Pastoral. Indeed, the Fifth Symphony and the Pastoral were originally numbered in reverse order when they were premiered, both on the same night in the same concert. And we must also remember that he wasn't just composing symphonies, but everything else, all the other categories of music as well, in massive abundance. In 1805, for example, when what we call the Fifth Symphony was begun, he was also composing the Fourth Piano Concerto, two very, very different works. So in this way, one section of a sketchbook may contain ideas to be used in half a dozen different compositions. Now here's the idea that opens the Fifth Symphony. Now, as a melodic and harmonic idea, it is simplicity itself. But equally important is the rise between the second and the third of these notes. And if you change the order of those four notes, then that gives you the interval of a fourth. Dee-dum, ba-dum. And so we already have a new possibility that generates a whole fresh idea. And if you add that to the so-called fate knocking at the door rhythm, you know, ba-ba-ba-bam, in the cellos and the basses, then you're sitting on dynamite. if we had time, we could examine every bar. But that might run until next season's Wimbledon. We would still be finding new things to talk about 6 months from now. But instead, let us play that first movement of Beethoven's Fifth, and you'll hear for yourself how those 4 notes generate an entire musical structure. That was the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Now, as a conductor, your responsibility, first and last, is to those notes as written, wiping from your memory all preconceived notions. What I mean is that you must forget the day-to-day circumstances of the composer's life and how such circumstances might or might not have found expression in the music. It's difficult a lot of the time, but that is what you must at least try to do. More important is, how accurate are those written notes, those dots and dashes? Musical notation can at times be really hopelessly vague, even when dealing with absolutely fundamental ingredients of music. Let's forget about the influence of yellow hammers in the park and fate or people knocking on doors, and just look at those four notes as they appear in the score. The fourth note is marked with a pause over it. Well, but how long should that pause be? Is it like this? Or is it like this? And it's marked with two Fs. Fortissimo, very loud. Well, wait a minute. How loud is loud? How soft is soft? And when a composer like Stravinsky specifies loud, is it the same degree of loudness? Or even more importantly, the same quality of attack as when you play Mozart? Of course not. So how do you decide, as a conductor or as an instrumentalist, that your interpretation of the notes is the only possible correct one? After all, no two conductors are alike, and no two performances are identical. And much more to the point, every time you play a piece, you discover new details you hadn't noticed before. The truth is, I guess, that there is never any single or definitive interpretation. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that the greater the composition, the more your understanding of it is likely to change over the years. That's what's so wonderful and exciting about being a musician. And while we're on this point, can I deal with one question that always seems to worry people? How could Beethoven, they say, when deafness overtook him, really know what he was writing? Now that's not a silly question, and I don't want to be dismissive about it. But the answer is, of course he knew exactly what he was doing. And had he been able to hear, I'm convinced he would not have written a single note differently. Think about it for a moment. You can write a letter, putting words to paper, and while you're writing those letters, you understand those words mentally, without having to hear them out loud. And it's the same with composers, who have learned to put musical notes on a manuscript paper as easily as words in a letter. But everybody works differently, and while Beethoven's habit was to jot down his ideas in sketchbooks, Mozart, apparently, resolved every detail in his head, before he committed the entire work onto paper. He hardly ever changed so much as a note. Other composers like to try out ideas at a keyboard. Haydn, for example. There's nothing shameful in that. It's simply different composers use different methods. After all, it's in here where the real work happens. And for Beethoven, deafness was not a technical handicap, but a social, day-to-day frustration. And in that sense, obviously, deafness did affect what he wrote. As he became increasingly cut off from those around him, so he withdrew more and more into his own very private world of imagination, as his last string quartets and piano sonatas testify. In a moment, we'll conclude this program with a performance of his Seventh Symphony. But first, I want to tell you about an incident which actually happened and which illustrates how appalling, how dreadful it must have been as deafness slowly and progressively overtook him, when he could finally hear only the loud passages of the music. He completed the Seventh Symphony in May 1812, when he was 41 years old. He was at the height of his fame, but 18 months elapsed before the first performance. Why such a delay? Well, possibly because he planned to visit England and wished to save up a new major work for the occasion. But that visit never happened. Beethoven himself conducted the premiere in Vienna. The German violinist, composer, and conductor, Louis Spohr, was in the orchestra as a player, along with other distinguished musicians, and he gave us a very vivid account of how Beethoven directed the orchestra. Although much had been told me about his way of conducting, it nevertheless astounded me to the utmost degree. Beethoven was in the habit of giving dynamic indications to the orchestra by means of all sorts of peculiar movements of his body. When he wanted a sforzando, he would vehemently throw out both his arms, which previously he had held across his breast. For a piano, he would crouch down, going down deeper as he wanted the sound to be softer. Then at the beginning of a crescendo, he would rise gradually, and when the forte was reached, he would leap into the air. Some people still do that. The execution was quite masterly, despite Beethoven's uncertain and sometimes ludicrous conducting. It was evident that the poor, deaf master was no longer able to hear the quiet passages in his music. This was particularly so in the sections where pauses are marked over two consecutive chords. The first one loud, the second soft. Beethoven had probably overlooked the second one because he started beating time again before the orchestra had even begun the second pause. Therefore, without realizing it, he was ahead of the orchestra by as much as 10 or 12 bars when it began to play a pianissimo. Beethoven, indicating the passage in his own way, had crouched down under the music stand. At the crescendo which followed, he became visible once more, making himself taller, and then he leapt high into the air at the moment he thought the forte should have begun. When it did not materialize, he looked about in terror, stared astonished at the orchestra, which was still playing the pianissimo, and found his place only when the so long-awaited forte became audible to him. Now that story is really unbelievably sad, but it does tell us quite a lot about Beethoven's approach to the interpretation of his own music, particularly the dramatic and wildly contrasting dynamics, the exaggeration between extremes of loudness and softness. As time went on, there would usually be a skilled musician standing just at Beethoven's elbow, ready to give that vital nod or even a tactful upbeat when the performance seemed doomed to fall apart at the seams. By all accounts, the players themselves respected him, this stocky, floundering windmill genius of a man. Indeed, the performance on that occasion was such a success that the audience demanded an encore of the slow movement right there and then. The critics, though, they were not quite so impressed. Evidently, they were the same then as they are now. The The finale of this symphony was particularly singled out as absurd, untamed music, the acme of shapelessness, a delirium in which there's no trace of melody or harmony, no single sound to fall gratefully upon the ear. Indeed, someone who you'd think should have known better, Weber, the composer of Freischütz and 16 years Beethoven's junior, later heard that work in Leipzig and said, on the strength of the Seventh Symphony, Beethoven should be locked away in a madhouse. Others said that when Beethoven composed the first and the fourth movements of that symphony, he must clearly have been drunk. Now, what can Beethoven possibly have written to provoke such hostility? He looked upon the symphony with great fondness, regarding it as one of his very best works. Melodically, it's certainly glorious. Rhythmically, it's got immense verve, and its overall sense of design is perfect. Richard Wagner, who could never resist the temptation of opposing a storyline on any piece of music, however abstract, described Beethoven's Seventh as the apotheosis of the dance. The story is told that Wagner pranced around the room, improvising a balletic interpretation of the symphony, while Franz Liszt thrashed it out on the piano. Oh, what I would have given to have been there. Mind you, Richard Wagner could listen to a piece of music and tell you what the composer had had for breakfast. But on this occasion, Wagner was quite right to talk of this symphony in rhythmic terms, as a piece that danced and even sailed along. So where was the problem? Well, one thing that upset Beethoven's critics was the way the piece wanders off from one key to another. Now, that's how it starts, but in no time at all, we're here. Our center of gravity has changed from A major to C major. Well, you will say, what's all the fuss about? To us, those chords do not conflict in the least with each other. But to Beethoven's contemporaries, they were as different as chalk and cheese. The fact is, we're so used to all that noise, those transistor radios, rock and roll, you name it, that our ears have lost their innocence. Another thing that didn't go down too well was the way Beethoven seems to simply be fooling around at various moments. Now, to us, that transition is nothing more than playful and innocent. Indeed, of all of Beethoven's symphonies, this one is built up from the most unassuming ingredients. There are numerous passages where, for instance, he simply runs up and down the scale, interspersed with very straightforward chords in the woodwind. But what really upset the apple cart was a passage which develops kind of musical hiccups and stops dead a couple of times, then hops away up and down the scale of C major. I'm sure half the problem was that nobody could ever bring themselves to admit that the great Beethoven actually possessed a sense of humor. But underneath this jokiness, there is a very assured hand, believe me. We can see him taking liberties time and again, using ideas that in themselves seem, well, trite. Now that is the theme of the second movement. And how's that for seeming banality? That line of notes, without any indication of harmony, first appears in one of his sketchbooks 6 years previously. And it goes to show you how his sketchbooks were just an aide-memoire, because that tune is really drivel unless you realize that for 6 years he carried in his mind its full potential, harmony, counter melodies, etc., without which those notes make really almost no sense at all. And when Beethoven does harmonize that apparently silly tune, you realize that sooner or later something vast and processional will blow your head off. Meanwhile, he's willfully setting you up for what is to come, and he's got you exactly where he wants you. He compounds the mystery by starting, as he will end the movement, with an extraordinary chord, which has no bass note to root it in reality. Notice the darkness in that orchestration, dividing all those lower strings in their most somber register. As I said, deaf or no, Beethoven knew precisely, every second of the time, the effect he was creating. Time is catching up with us, but there's just one more detail I want to mention. I said earlier that it's possible that Beethoven delayed the premiere of this work because of a possible trip to England. He'd already been commissioned by an Edinburgh publisher, a man called George Thompson, to arrange a large number of Scottish, Irish, and Welsh folk songs. Well, that was really a pretty trivial commission, but Beethoven took it on because he needed the money. Now, one of the tunes he was sent was a little Irish ditty called Nora Crana. Beethoven dresses this up and uses it for the opening theme of the finale, surrounded by trumpets and drums. It may have started as an Irish folk song, but he certainly puts it through some transformation. Well, now it's time to play the complete work. I've chosen it because of all his symphonies, and despite all the thought and drafting and redrafting and sheer hard work that he put into every note he ever composed, this piece makes it all seem utterly spontaneous. In our next program, we shall be looking at the Symphony Fantastique, composed by Hector Berlioz, a man who admired Beethoven as a god, a piece Berlioz composed within a couple of years of Beethoven's death. Well, we too revere Beethoven, and the magnificent power of his creative vision. I suppose in today's world we all use words like greatness and genius a little more readily than we should. But, as has so often been said, the true mark of an artist is to conceal the artistry that he puts into his work, the ability to take the most basic materials, as we've seen, the bricks and the mortar, and to build from them something supremely imaginative and fresh. And in his Seventh Symphony, Beethoven did just that.